Patrick and I will be sharing a little bit around the topic of queer liberation. And as we get started in that conversation, I just want to share a framework that's been helpful for me in thinking about how my own practice is liberatory and how that relates to my various identities, including my queer identity. And so the framework I wanted to share is it is sort of from the book Radical Dharma by Lama Rod Owens, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, and Dr. Jasmine Sedula. The book is Radical Dharma, and they developed a framework that they called the Radical Dharma 5. So they actually developed this framework after publishing the book. So it's not actually in the book, which is a little confusing, but it's still an excellent book. I highly recommend it. But the framework itself, this framework of the Radical Dharma 5, they developed as they did workshops after publishing the book. So I learned this in a workshop that Lama Rod Owens led at the East Bay Meditation Center a couple years ago. So I'm just going to put in the chat also these 5 qualities that that they came up with as the elements of radical Dharma. So the 5 are contemplative approach. And I think this one is kind of like, in a way, the one that seems the most obvious as we do our meditation practices, other contemplative or inquiry practices. This is like how we're leaning into practice as contemplation, as a place for inquiry and self-reflection. The second one is embodied practice. So really looking at how do we bring our practice into our bodies? How are our bodies part of our practice? And the third, the one I want to tease out a little bit tonight, is this question of liberatory path. So really looking at how is our practice a liberatory path? So I'm going to come back to that one. But I wanted to also mention the last 2, prophetic praxis. And here they're really talking about how do we have a truth-telling element to our practice? How is our practice part of really sharing our truth and our lived experience in ways that can be, ways that we can be an agent for change, that we can be bringing the reality of our experience into different spaces, different conversations and communities. And then the final one is collective process. So in what way are we engaging in the collective in our practice? So for instance, just even talking about our principles here at East Bay Meditation Center, including gift economics, are a piece of our collective practice. But just to come back to the liberatory path, one of the things that I've heard Lama Rod Owens say a lot as I've been listening to him is, he says, what are you practicing for? Who are you practicing for? And that to me is a question I come back to in my practice on a pretty daily basis. This question of who or what am I practicing for? I think one thing that I received as I, entered the path around, in the insight tradition or the Theravada tradition, is this idea that I'm practicing for my own liberation, that I'm practicing for the end of my suffering. And that's been an ultimately really unsatisfying answer for me. I am not just practicing for my own liberation or the end of my suffering. I am really practicing because I see it as a path to liberation and a way to also ease the suffering of others. And I did a talk last night with another dear friend and Dharma sibling, Leslie Booker. And we were talking about identity, kind of the paradox of identity, and a little bit about that there is essentially no self, and at the same time we live, with intersectionality with all of our different marginalized identities and privileged identities, and that is a very concrete relative reality that we can't avoid by going into this sense of not self. That's what we call a spiritual bypass. So how are we actually practicing within all of our, our identities, the places where we hold privilege or might be more towards the center, the places where we might have less privilege and be more at the margins? How do those different identities reveal reality to us so that we can understand where we are located in systems of oppression? So for me, my practice, this is a very important part of my practice, is this relative reality of structural oppression and the places where I hold more and less privilege, and the understanding that I can also get from looking at the experience of, my other beloved community members who may be more at the margins than I am, knowing that from the margins we actually see reality quite a bit more clearly than we do sometimes at the center. So those are some of the things that I think about in terms of like, how is my practice a liberatory path, and how am I practicing, for instance, around understanding the lived experience of Black trans women and knowing that as long as they don't get to be fully human, I don't get to be fully human, practicing around the realities of missing and murdered Indigenous women, knowing as long as they're not treated as full humans entitled to life and subjectivity, I too am not fully human and entitled to life and subjectivity. So those are just like some of the questions that I like really sit with in my own practice. So I just wanted to offer that as my understanding of what's being talked about as this liberatory path. And for me, my queer identity and my trans identity, as well as my identity as Latinx mixed person, all of these things are very much a part of how I'm experiencing this liberatory path. So I wanted to offer that framework just to get us started, and I want to hand over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks, Ray, so much. So much I want to pull from what you've offered and shared, and also just like loving the way that your story weaves into this teaching. So beautiful. This idea of like, what are we practicing for, right? This liberation that's possible. When I came to the Dharma, I came through the doorway of suffering, like so many folks. I was really struggling. I had a lot of internal chaos, and I was trying to solve it by making everything on the external okay. And so my practice has really been around this, the first noble truth of accepting that there is suffering in all life, and then really quickly trying to get to this third noble truth of like the ending of suffering. What does that mean? What does it look like? Like I remember sitting through Dharma talks with Larry Yang early on at EBMC and saying, okay, cool, but like, how do we end the suffering? I was just, in so much pain. And the revelations and the study and practices have really driven me towards this idea that there is an end to the suffering. The Eightfold Path has definitely driven me in places where my suffering is less than it was before. There have even been moments where I felt no suffering, right? This storyline around kind of the awakening that can happen and at the end of suffering, like, is it temporary or is it permanent? Like I will awaken, and in this lifetime I will awaken, and then these I won't experience any of the same suffering. I just am not so sure. I often ask people when I'm teaching, I'm like, why are you practicing? Do you think you will awaken and enlighten in this lifetime? And if you do, great. Some of us are less certain. And so what does it mean to have momentary moments of awakening and less suffering? I love the 5 pieces you're laying out, Renee, like particularly like the contemplative approach. That's what we all practice together, this silent meditation, but the embodiment, right? Though, how do you do it in your body? The somatic practices that are so well aligned with the Theravada and the Vipassana traditions. And then this liberatory path. I love the idea that like, it's dissatisfying for me just to be without suffering. Like I can't be free until you're free. This is like, my father was a deacon in the Baptist church and often would talk about like, we're not free until we're all free. It's just the truth in my community. And so I love the way you're setting up this framework. I'm going to tell you how do I make it queer. So here's my queerness is like, I, came out in the midst of a lot of really like challenges. Like I didn't feel like I could be queer. I didn't feel like if I revealed my attraction to men and my building a life with my now queer husband, like I didn't feel it was accepted by my family. I had to really drive towards like this idea and very confidently kind of fake it till you make it and then push. And it just reminds me of this story I'm going to tell really fast, which is the story of Gautama, of sitting under the Bodhi tree. As the story goes, he comes to sit under the tree, and as he's sitting there and waiting to awaken, and he's practicing, the evil demon Mara shows up with all these temptations and these scary monsters, and while Gautama is practicing, he's being tempted and he's being scared by these monsters, and Mara is throwing everything at him like, who do you think you are? Why do you get to think you get to awaken? I have more practice than you. I'm closer to enlightenment than you. All these things, these distractions and attacks. And the Buddha, soon to be Buddha, like falls into himself and like offers a flower, and the demons dispel. And he puts his hand down on the earth and says, "It's by my birthright. The power of the earth is my witness." And so I'm just going to share a slide real quick. If you've ever seen these mudras before, the story that can be told by looking at the images, right? And this is my favorite pose and image, where the Buddha reaches down and touches the earth and really says, Renee, you were saying like the earth will have our back as one of the practices. Like, yes, the earth knows our value. The earth knows our power. And so by touching the earth, we therefore are affirmed in our birthright. And so that is the queerest stuff I've ever heard in the Dharma. That's what I had to do to get my queer self alive. And so I just share that as like my personal, like, it's my favorite mudra, and it's a great story. And I hope something there lands valuably. Yeah. Yeah, queer liberation, Renee. I don't know what else we can do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing that story of the Buddha as a story of our queer liberation. And yeah, I'm just curious, in your own practice, where does that queer liberation show up? And I love that you were also, bringing in that, like, how do we practice in our bodies? Is there a way that we as queer folks bring embodiment to the practice as well?
Yeah, I honestly think that it's really around the collective liberation is where it shows up in my practice. I'm very fortunate to be friends and colleagues with Renee. I've got friends on this call, and I feel like in those spaces, my practice is that we hold each other accountable. We hold each other in this liberatory practice. We don't let ourselves be too swayed by the doubt that always arises, right? Or by the fatigue that always arises. I feel like my practice towards gay or queer liberation is in community, because we are moving together. You want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go together. And so I feel like my shared Kalyanamita, the places I teach, the places I study, that's where my queer practice really is like most liberatory. Yeah. How about for you?
Yeah, I feel like it's similar for me. The ways that we really practice as community, is one piece. And I'm reading a book right now called The Buddha's Wife, and that's looking at the story of Yasudhara, who was the wife of the Buddha. And the Buddha, on the day when their son was born, went forth and abandoned, Yasudhara and their son Rahula. And so it's looking at the stories of the women and the creation of the Women's Sangha. And I also found a lot to identify with there, and these women creating community and creating a path of relational practice within community that's not about going off, on this solitary search for enlightenment, but instead staying in relationship and finding our awakening together.
Mm,
And I feel like that is very queer.
I love it. I know we're
We're
running.
very, very oriented that way.
I agree. I agree. Um, I am also curious, we've been in the mix for a minute. I wonder if you have any perspective on kind of how queerness has spread through the Dharma. There was a time when there certainly weren't trans daylongs and LGBT sanghas, certainly not as prevalent as they are now. I wonder if you have a perspective on kind of how that's happening and what's happening, what's coming next.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that our sanghas that we're creating, East Bay Meditation Center was created first as a place for our queer communities, our Alphabet community to practice, as well as our POC community to practice. That is what EBMC is. And now, as you and I, Patrick, are part of this program that's training thousands of people all over the world to be meditation teachers, it is the East Bay Meditation Center agreements for multicultural interaction that's grounding that program. It is our white awareness program that's grounding this program. Like, little does everyone know, like EBMC is like seeding Dharma communities and practice communities all over the world through being part of training these folks. And another thing, I had recently an opportunity with JD Doyle, who also teaches here at Alphabet. The two of us were just doing a training around gender for Spirit Rock teachers. And, I really realized, this is like our learnings from doing the trans, non-binary, gender expansive retreats, where holding the community in a hierarchical way just doesn't work. So we're really creating other forms that are really much more community oriented. And now we can take the benefit of what we're learning and bring it back to the more hierarchical, like Spirit Rock structure. But I think what I'm seeing and what I'm hoping for is that our experience as queer, trans, POC, practitioners and teachers is actually going to transform the Dharma in the West to something that's much more sustainable. Like, truly, Dharma in the West is in a crisis. Community after community is falling apart because of patriarchy and white supremacy. And we are creating something that's much more sustainable, that's much more alive and supportive.
Yes, from your mouth to the Buddha's ears. Yes, that is what's happening. Transform, transform. I'm just going to throw a little spice here at the end before we break into some small groups, which is that I have to work sometimes not to hold resentment and regret around the way that I experienced harm as I was growing through the Dharma, being in spaces that were all white, that were all cis het, being in spaces that were really very difficult. And because the change that you're pointing to is like happening faster and faster, there's such a different experience for me now in those spaces. And I struggle sometimes not to regret or be upset about it. And I have to remember, like this teaching that Larry gave a long time ago, that the Dharma is influenced by everybody who practices it, right? As you are changed, you are also changing the Dharma. And there was a point when the more hierarchical, the more I don't know how to say it, but the more hierarchical old versions of like, I am the teacher, you are student, I will tell you my wisdom and you must absorb it. Like, it just doesn't serve us anymore. And I'm so glad that there's so many of us, and the EBMC is a hub for people that can think more expansively and broadly about how we're consciously transforming the Dharma.